board, they put this event together in a very short amount of time, exclusive really on their own. I was just a passenger on this ride. They took the lead in organizing all the panelists, organizing this event, advertising the event. So I thank them. I want to thank all of our panelists and all of those who came to support us, those administration. I see Dean Willett here, and I saw Dean Queen in here, so thank you for attending. I'm going to give a brief introduction of really some laws, discriminatory laws against Asian Americans since the early days of American history and leading us to where we are today. During the California Gold Rush, there was a large immigration of Chinese immigrants coming then. So this is the late 1800s. And there was a fear of an invasion and fear of cheap labor. And we have this theme of fear again, really from many immigrant groups, even today, that in Congress in 1982 passed the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which banned new immigration from China and banned existing residents from becoming US citizens. Now, ironically, it was the Chinese Exclusion Act that led to the 1898 Supreme Court decision of United States v. Wang Kim Ark, where the Supreme Court recognized birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment, which we also see in the news today. In the 1900s, at the turn of the century, there was a concern of rising immigration from Southeast Asia, and Congress passed another Immigration Act, which created what was called the Asiatic Barred Zone. So they didn't name specific countries, but they named geographic regions based on latitude and longitude, which excluded immigrants from China, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. It wasn't until 1965 that Congress actually removed race-specific barriers, but created other issues by giving priority to highly skilled immigrants, which contributed to then the model minority myth, which exists to this day. And being at this school and being with American history, I can't talk about the history of Asian American discrimination without discussing Japanese internment during World War II, following the attack on Pearl Harbor. 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent were taken from their homes. Supreme Court upheld that decision in Korematsu versus United States in 1944. An alumnus of this school, Justice Robert Jackson, wrote a dissent, and I'd just like to read a few words because I read these words every so often. So here's an attempt to make an otherwise innocent act a crime merely because the prisoner is a son of parents as to whom he had no choice and belongs to a race from which there is no way to resign. Now, perhaps ironically, when the Supreme Court upheld former President Trump's the travel ban, the court took an opportunity to say, this, the dissent used it, and the majority then, the dissent gave the opportunity to make express what is already obvious. Korematsu was gravely wrong the day it was decided and has now been overruled in the court of history, and to be clear, has no place in law under the Constitution. And I call it ironically because then in that same decision upheld perhaps other forms of bigotry. So where are we today? We all saw the rise of violence against Asian Americans rose 150% in the last year, the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, President Trump's use of Kung flu and Chinese virus. We saw a similar rise of violence after 9/11 against Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs, many of whom were South Asians, and including at least 3 deaths then. So these issues, unfortunately, are not new. And the unfortunate event that perhaps motivated this panel was the shooting in Georgia just last month. A lot, I was asked briefly to speak about hate crimes because that was we all saw news reports and people calling that this is a hate crime. It was disputed then by the chief of police, and I'm not going to repeat his words that I know hurt many of us. So what is a hate crime? Well, it's largely defined by each of the jurisdictions. And all it does is it adds a penalty enhancement. It might make a sentence longer if it's found motivated by hate against certain groups defined by that jurisdiction. Federally, it's only race, color, religion, and national origin. In New York and Georgia, they're actually very similar, right? So race, color, religion, national origin. But unlike the federal system, both New York and Georgia add sex, sexual orientation, gender, mental disability, and physical disability to that group. I tried to do some research to find out what the shooter has been charged with. I know he's been charged with murder, but I don't see anything about whether there is, at least currently, a hate crimes enhancement. And now I want to begin turning it to our panelists. With the rise of rhetoric from President Trump, and not just him, but many other politicians, I'd like to ask Shukla, who's an alumna of this school, but now works in New York City, what has she seen in the change from where she is with the change in rhetoric and with the rise of anti-Asian rhetoric?
Thank you so much, Professor. Good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. My name is Chaula Shukla, and I currently work at Cardozo Law School down in New York City. Previously working at Albany Law, my alma mater, and a school I love. Cardozo Law School's class of 2020 was 11.2% Asian American Pacific Islander. So I work directly with a lot of students in, the Asian community. And I think that the first thing that comes to mind is just trauma. A lot of people just experiencing a lot of trauma through the events that have occurred last month and just the events that have been going on kind of since, always. There's always been, unfortunately, hate, discrimination, fear, and harassment. But I think especially with what's going on with the, COVID-19 pandemic, seeing, the Asian American community being targeted in just these horrific ways. So I know that there's Mayor de Blasio is working on creating an Asian hate crime task force, and I know that the New York City Bar Association and the Asian American Bar Association are kind of putting out some guidance on how to handle all these things and report what's been going on. New York City, is slowly trying to kind of reopen in light of the pandemic, but I know at the very beginning of the pandemic, you saw a decrease in, I'm so sorry, excuse me, wanting to, in terms of, small businesses and how the Asian American community has such a presence in, areas like Queens and Manhattan and Chinatown. And just like there was this fear of even going to those businesses and kind of supporting them. And I think that's a huge, huge thing. Just from my perspective, in terms of the rhetoric, I think clearly it's, President Trump was a president who really emboldened a lot of people to kind of give in to these instincts of hate, and he kind of was a fear mongerer, not kind of, he was absolutely a fear mongerer. And what came was this, and we always think of New York City as just being this very sophisticated cosmopolitan place and so diverse, which it certainly is. But when you have administration that's really stoking fear, and anytime you have a time of economic insecurity too, like post 9/11, which, we saw a lot of South Asian being targeted in similar ways, and a lot of xenophobia and racism. Anytime you have this time of economic insecurity, I also think it just really brings out those instincts of wanting to place blame or assign blame to somebody because you're, experiencing, loss of work or some kind of economic, strife. New York City is a really interesting place, but it's also a resilient place. I think, post 9/11 and post the 2008 recession and now with the pandemic, I do always like to believe, that we can unite and kind of unify against hate. We have a new administration, but that doesn't sort of course, undo the damage that's been done by the previous administration. So, I think just, I'd love to, hear from the other panelists as well, but that's kind of some of my initial thoughts.
Right. Thank you. And I just want to give everyone first, there was a request to record this proceeding, and unfortunately I forgot, so the recording started late, but I just want everyone who's on this call or on the Zoom to know that this proceeding is being recorded. I always like to give that warning, for that. Thank you, Chaula, for discussing your experience in New York City. And I think one thing we also can't forget that it was also in the midst of a very heavily contested presidential election, which always causes another rise in rhetoric. And I'd also like to ask Jinah Kim, a business owner, a 1L, so I'm not sure how she does it all, but she does. What has she seen from her perspective, both as a business owner and as a one?
Oh, thank you so much, Professor. So I guess I can speak in terms of being someone who has had a business in downtown Troy, New York for about 5 years now. And I grew up in Latham, so I'm very familiar with the capital region. This is my home. And what we've been seeing, and again, like the rhetoric isn't new, we've been seeing this over and over again. Even all the anti-immigrant sentiments that we had to deal with a couple of years ago with all the migrants coming, and even the anti-Muslim ban. And so for us, we've had to, address those things and see the fear trickle in our communities. When it comes to even things like immigration status, and green card holders and citizens were even concerned about their own well-being. And for us to now, what we've been grappling with is just a lot of uncertainty and fear. And I think even recognizing that our region is not New York City, it's very different. We have small pockets of communities when it comes to Asians and Asian Americans, but we also feel extremely isolated. So as we're organizing for rallies and collecting voices, especially of younger Asian American women, the same reoccurring kind of concern and fear that people have been expressing is that we've been feeling so alone. Like we've been feeling like even with Black Lives Matter and different movements happening across the country, we didn't have a collective voice in a place like the capital region. So I feel like for the first time ever, we are coming together and we're responding to rhetoric that has existed, very subtle messaging and things that happen in our daily lives that we've been kind of like just bottling in up until this point. So of course, there's this huge explosion. We feel like this is our opportunity to finally speak up and become collective in addressing these issues. But at the same time, really, it goes beyond the violence. It's infiltrated every aspect. And as a restaurant owner, I see it a lot with food, even with perception of Asian food and the appropriation of our culture and our food is very much prevalent to that same rhetoric that has been much more over and exposed at this point.
And thank you. You just reminded me of something that I think we've heard a few times, at the to Stop Asian Hate rally a few weeks ago was, we were always taught to just, keep your head down, don't cause a lot of ripples. And now we are causing ripples, and we have allies for that too. So I want to thank everyone. Would any of our other panelists like to address that issue, what they might have seen either in their own practices or in their own lives with the rise in the anti-Asian rhetoric?
I could jump in here, Louis. And
please.
Jinah, you said something that really that I've been thinking about a lot, and it's something that the actor Steve Yeun, who recently was the first Asian American to be nominated for Best Actor at the Oscars. He actually said something very interesting that hit home for me, is that being Asian American seems to be where you are thinking about everyone else and nobody is thinking about you, and that seems to be, I think it's like an overarching feeling among Asian American, the Asian American experience, is that this feeling of being alone, whether it's you're the only Asian kid in your class growing up, or you're one of few Asian families in a particular town. There's just this, we've always felt very alone, I think. And so, the interesting thing is that we sort of build this community where we're coming together because we have felt so alone. So I think that's something that's very central to the Asian American experience. I think from my own practice standpoint, I'm an immigration lawyer, and the past 4 years practicing immigration law under President Trump, the best I could say is that it was never boring, but it was incredibly difficult, incredibly challenging, stressful. The truth is, business was good, but it's not the kind of business that you want long term, because it's just unsustainable. It's just incredibly stressful. And so, and the interesting thing is we we represent a lot of professionals from China, from India, and other Asian countries, and America has always been a place where people wanted to come here. My parents included. It was always this place where you could come and the cliche of the American dream. But over during the Trump administration, people were starting to clients were starting to tell me is it really worth it to come here anymore? When I could, in places like China and India, are those economies are growing and the quality of life is improving, and a lot of these people who have been waiting for years in the queue for their paperwork to come through, they're actually starting to question whether it's worth it to build their lives here and raise their children here. And I think with COVID and the rise in anti-Asian violence, I think those feelings are even more prevalent now than ever.
Thank you, Brian. Other panelists want to jump in on this? Okay.
I would like to add just that, now I know all of us have touched on this, but there is acknowledgement now about what is going on. And, you did speak to the statistics of how much hate crimes have gone up, but it is very kind of hard to fathom that that is probably severely underreported. You also mentioned that thing that you were taught was to keep your head down and not make ripples. And again, part of that is, keeping quiet, not saying anything. Those again won't speak to the statistics that we need to really combat this issue. So I guess, a big thing is acknowledging it, and then, having the tools to figure out what is going on. But a big thing about it is acknowledgement. And then like to speak about, Jinah, she talked about how she has a business. Another thing is, Asian businesses have hurt more than, other types of businesses going through this. And, I guess I would like to see a lot more acknowledgement of these businesses that have been suffering in all these different areas around the country as well.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up. I remember reading at the early days of the pandemic an article saying that the dim sum places in New York City and LA and San Francisco were just empty. And if you ever visited those places on a weekend before the pandemic, you're going to wait for an hour or two standing. So thank you for bringing that up. I'd like to ask, the panelists now about really what they've seen, in their personal lives or practice lives as an Asian American attorney, now practicing for a number of years, what might have changed from when they were in law school to in practice to perhaps now when we have experience spanning decades, really from all of our panelists. And I'd like to start with Brian, if I may, on that issue.
I guess, my own experience has been, I think if I could maybe just kind of testify a bit publicly about my experiences, I think part of the reason, maybe I never really admitted it to myself before, but I think part of the reason I went to law school was because that I didn't want to be seen as the quiet, stereotypical Asian that went into engineering or became a doctor. Lawyers, I think Asian parents still like lawyers, but it's something it's not, it's not one of our stereotypical professions that we pursue. And then, I went to Temple Law School, one of the best legal writing and trial advocacy programs in the country. And I went through the trial advocacy program also because I think, doing trial law is something that you don't necessarily see Asian Americans going into as well. And so that, I think for me, that was part of what drove me was this desire to fight these stereotypes. I think, after I graduated law school, I went into immigration law. I did immigration court work for a while. And by then I think I had, I calmed down a bit with, stereotype fighting, and I was just trying to earn a living. But, still, I think I guess with immigration law, for me personally, I started my career representing Chinese immigrants in Philadelphia. So a lot of that experience was, representing people who, they weren't my specific community, but, I could speak their language. And we had a lot more in common than if there was, a non-Asian American lawyer representing them. And so, and that's one of the tricky things was, you want to really empathize with your clients and get to know them and understand them. But at the same time, they, you sort of, it's hard to sometimes maintain enough distance to handle their cases objectively. And also, with a lot of these clients, if you're from their community, you end up, you're often asked to do things, whether ethical or unethical, that you have to push back against, precisely because they saw you as one of them. And so that, I think that was one of the struggles that I had early on in my legal career that maybe a non-Asian American lawyer would have had, doing this kind of work. I guess after that, I opened my own practice. Well, no, before that, I joined the Legal Aid Society, and Lillian, my old boss, is on here. So I practice immigration law here in Albany, which is a very, very different, it's a very different practice geographically, depending on where you are, because different immigrant groups tend to congregate in different parts of the country. And so when I got to Albany, I think my clientele was largely Caribbean and Caribbean, Central American, not a lot of Asian clients. And so it was still, the interesting thing was I wasn't really, quote unquote, one of them anymore, but I could still, coming from a family with immigrant background, I could still empathize with their struggles and their concerns. But I think I still struggled a bit with being seen as, I was the Chinese lawyer or the Asian lawyer. And I think that when I left Legal Aid to open my own solo practice, I was very concerned about being seen as, as the Asian lawyer in town. And so I think maybe I either consciously or unconsciously tried to avoid having too much of a presence among the local Asian immigrant community, only because I just didn't want to be I didn't want to be typecast, to borrow from Hollywood, to be that role. And I might have sacrificed some business by doing that. And I don't know if it was the right decision, looking back, but that was one of the issues that I dealt with when I was coming up.
Thank you, Brian. And Professor Connors, if I could ask you to share your thoughts, I think you can give us a unique perspective, not just as a practicing attorney, but also as a member of the faculty and perhaps what you've seen over the years from our students.
Well, I came to this, I came to this country as an immigrant. So I'm Southeast Asian, I'm an immigrant. I have to start by saying, when I think back, my grandfather, who was a thoracic surgeon in India, he failed his medical board 7 times. And, my parents and my grandparents grew up under the Raj, the British Raj. And later he came to find out that he had passed each time. And so it's, I come with a lot of baggage when I immigrated to this country. The British didn't leave India till 1947. And then there was the partitioning. along religious lines based on if you're Hindu or a Muslim. And I see that happening again in our times now. I see the divisiveness, and I look at Modi as kind of a quasi-Trump. And so it's really disheartening because I feel like I've come from, I am not happy with the country of my birth. And at this time, this moment, I'm not happy with the country of my citizenship. And, as Brian pointed out, in my legal career, in law school, for instance, I was told I was the first Southeast Asian to attend the law school. This was in the early 80s. And I went to Syracuse Law School. And so in my family, I don't know about a lot of you, we put a lot of emphasis on education. So I had a lot of, stress on my shoulders to do well and to excel, but to be told that, hey, you're holding the banner for all Southeast Asian Americans, specifically Indian Americans. That's a lot to handle as a 21-year-old. And, in my career, I went into public service after graduation. I was in legal services offices. And, I think the hardest things I dealt with were when I saw seemingly progressive people, my colleagues, making these off-the-cuff remarks, which were so hurtful to me, but which they thought were actually complimentary. Some things like, oh, you speak English so well, or you write so well, or when I had children, my husband is a white American, and they would say your kids look like so-and-so's kids, because that person was also a child of mixed race, Asian and white. So those kinds of compliments, definitely, it was hard. I never said anything. I just kind of accepted it, smiled, and went on. And as I've gotten older, I'm able to respond now and say, hey, wait a minute. Yeah, I can write. I grew up, even though I was born in India, India was, part of the British Raj, and English was my first language, as a matter of fact. And so the assumption, just by how you look, right, and your name, how that can affect how someone perceives you, the implicit biases that everyone carries. To this day, even in court, when I go there, a lot of times the guards will think I'm a client, even if I'm wearing a suit, because of the way I look. That hasn't changed much over the years. Although we like to think we've moved on in so many ways, I think that part it's still there. I am, as Brian said, that upstate New York, it's a very small number of Indian or Asian, Southeast Asian attorneys that practice family law. I think less than a handful. And like Brian, I don't want to be identified as that Indian attorney, but I think that's how I am identified, because there's so few of us in this area of practice, right? I do see bias in terms of the kinds of work I do when I think about child welfare and immigration. In the context of immigration, caseworkers going into people's homes and in neglect abuse proceedings, for instance, and I've discussed this with my students. A lot of immigrant families, like my family, we all slept in one room when we were growing up. We didn't have separate bedrooms, for instance, for our children. And in the context, here in this country, I think what a good parent or what an appropriate parent is for each child to have their own room or to share rooms if you're of the same gender, right? That's what's considered to be good parenting. So I've had cases, and students have seen cases where you have, parents found to be neglecting their child or providing inadequate guardianship merely by the fact that they are all together in one room. So those are the kinds of issues that are still that I still see going on right now. I don't know if I'm responding to the question you asked, Louis, but yeah, I think, you know, we're in a community with very few Asian American practicing lawyers in the area of family law, and that's the truth of it.
And first, Professor Connors, I both went to Syracuse University College of Law, so go Orange. But we both went to Syracuse.
Did they tell you were the first?
No,
I don't know.
I wasn't. By the time I went, I was not the first Chinese American to go to Syracuse. But I will, I guess, speak briefly into my own experience. Is that I almost went out of my way when I was at Syracuse to actually not be a part of APALSA. And I think it was something that Brian said that made me think of that, is that I didn't want to be, you know, the Chinese law student, right? I didn't want to be the best Chinese law. No, I just wanted to be the best law student. Just like my, you know, white classmates, right? No one goes, you're the best white law student, you're just the best law student. So that I actually, you know, and I remember speaking on an APALSA panel years ago when I went back to Syracuse as an alum, and I said it's kind of ironic that I actually do more APALSA events as a practicing attorney than I did as a law student, because I didn't appreciate, I think, how important it was when it was in law school to perhaps be a part of that community. And so, you know, thank you for speaking about your experiences. And Chaula, if I may ask you, you know, first your practice, but also you work with attorneys forming their identities, forming their career and professional identities, and if you could speak to that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, definitely just echoing a lot of what Professor Connors had to say just about her experience being, you know, South Asian. And, you know, I just remember years ago when I was in, I think, elementary school, I was learning to play the clarinet, which I was not very good at. And the band instructor said something, we were talking about math class, and I was saying how that was my least favorite class. And he said, well, no, I thought, you know, all Indian people are great at math, like, you know, or something. And I just remember, I don't know why that memory just really stayed with me. And I think it was the first time I encountered, you know, or remember encountering a microaggression, which I think is just hugely important to kind of think about and talk about. And I do think that there is this tendency not to want to react to microaggressions in the moment, or not really know how to kind of combat them, because again, it's something that someone is not thinking is going to be harmful. But what I've seen in working with law students who are developing their professional identity, that these microaggressions really take a toll on your, you know, professional identity, your confidence. A lot of people feel like they suffer from imposter syndrome. That comes up a lot in the work I do, and sort of you know, being a first generation law student. And not everybody identifies as being a first generation law student, but, you know, a lot of the students I work with who do will say that, you know, they feel like they are really hard on themselves. There's a lot of pressure to kind of succeed and perform. And I just think that, you know, even starting from like when your name is mispronounced, or, you know, if you're kind of expected to be quiet, or you're expected to like fit certain roles in certain categories. I think I've seen that come up a lot. So a lot of what I do is like try to, you know, work. I come from, I took a roundabout way into like being in law school and then working for law school. And I was a social worker. And a lot of what I think about and talk about is like the idea of trauma and intergenerational trauma. And I think like, it's not even my own words or my own observations, but during the pandemic, I will admit I laughed at it at first, but then I got onto TikTok, which I'm going to admit to this whole group. But I'm seeing a lot of South Asian people from the younger generation, Gen Z, kind of talk about, just be very outspoken about, you know, when your parents immigrate here, you know, some parents had arranged marriages and maybe they weren't really happy to be married to the person. And there's a lot of really sometimes toxic family dynamics and intergenerational trauma that kind of presents itself. And then how does that impact someone that's growing up in a different country? You know, you're leaving your home country to come somewhere for seemingly what you would think was a better opportunity. But it's, you know, the pressure and the stress that I think children go through. I know that in, you know, there's a lot of ways that it manifests itself. And I think when you're kind of building a legal career as a first generation, you know, student, there's just, like I said, a lot of difficult things to navigate. But I think being able to identify microaggressions and, you know, trying to speak out against them when you can, or at least have them documented somewhere, because those can really add up. And I think it's important for people to know that, you know, that this is how you pronounce my name, or, you know, this, that makes me uncomfortable when you kind of ask me about this or something like that. So it's kind of some of the work I try to do.
Thank you. And Jinah, if I can turn our attention, because you are a new law student, soon to be, you know, you're a few weeks away from finishing your first year, so you will be a 2L. Right? I'm sure that will feel good. But if you could speak to how you might be forming your own professional identity as a lawyer, certainly your identity as a business owner is very well defined, or is on its way, but as a lawyer, do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so I was in Dean Queenan's CivPro class, so I think she'll be able to attest to it. But I've really embraced, you know, that, or I've really like stepped into this role of wanting to. It's not necessarily because I want to go against what people perceive my identity to be, but just being very outspoken and the first one to raise my hand all the time. And I think that's also because of who I am naturally. But something I hear with a lot of my friends who may not have that same you know, outgoing personality type that I have, they'll say that being a law student, it's been a real challenge, like just participating, you know, because in school we were told to just listen to your teachers, and if anything, like we're just defined by whether we're fighting against it or whether we're going with it. But the things like, if you are naturally a little bit quieter, people perceive that to be because you are Asian American, and then they're impressed by me because I talk so much, and they're like, oh, like Asian, like especially Asian American women don't talk that much, especially in even in the business setting. People see how even like how loud my voice is or how loud I laugh, and my willingness to speak up. I think it shocks people, but at the same time, we don't want to be in a place where, at least for myself, where people look at me as just Asian, but also I have to recognize that I am, and this is, you know, it is a part of my identity, and it is who I am. Maybe partially because of my desire to fight against certain stereotypes, but I think just having that open discussion and ability to break stereotypes in the classroom setting, especially, it's been empowering for myself, at least.
Thank you, Jinah. And Allison, could you speak of what your experience was like as a student at Albany Law School, and then now as a practicing attorney in the Albany law community?
Sure. So just to give some background about myself, my mom, she is an immigrant from the Philippines. So I grew up with my father, he is white. So it was interesting growing up, and, you know, and it was in a predominantly white area, and having people like say sort of comments like, you know, did your mom make that sushi, or different types of comments. My mom, I don't look as much like my mom. She looks very different from me. So I do have a very distinct memory where my mom was going to parent-teacher conferences, and there was another Asian girl in my class, and you know, it was a common, you know, I believe it was a common Chinese last name, and my teacher at the time had assumed that my mother was that girl's mom. And my mom came back to me and was like, I think he thought I was somebody else's mother. He gave me all of her paperwork and we started discussing somebody completely different. But then I guess when I left home and I went to Albany Law School, I really gravitated towards being involved with APALSA. I was the former APALSA president. We did some really great events that I was very, you know, happy with and how they turned out. You know, to this day, I still try and stay as involved as I can with APALSA. I believe I have a former intern here on the e-board and a current intern here on the e-board, and I'm very happy with that. They're absolutely great. Thank you, Eileen and Ashley. Sorry to call you out. And now as an attorney, you know, at LASNY, Legal Aid Society of Northeastern New York, a lot of what some of the work that we do is we do try to keep track of the trends in the community, in the poverty population that we serve, And, statistically, LASNY actually, services fewer Asians than expected based on the presence in the poverty population. And, that is something that I've noticed. And, it is nice to work for an organization that is working towards outreach and reaching those communities and, trying to reach out to, all of the, Asian Americans that we can and providing the resources and materials that we can. It is nice that we also keep track of trends like that as well. But yeah, I would say that, I am particularly passionate about this type of work, and I'm happy to be on the panel. And, I look forward to continuing my work with APALSA, being a part of that too.
And thank you. And I'm going to take a moment to also call out another former APALSA president who's in the audience. I will not make you speak, Marina, but at least wanted to recognize Marina Chu, who's a former APALSA president. She, in fact, was the APALSA president who asked me to become the advisor 3 years ago, so I would not be the advisor, but for Marina. And I think, and I'm going to share the story about how we met Marina, if I may, is that it was before I was a faculty member here. I was either here judging a moot court competition, or I might have been teaching the Attorney General class at night. And it's the West Wing, unfortunately, some of our 1Ls might not know what the ensuring lobby is, but there's a set of tables where people meet. I'm about to leave and I see, I think it was 4 Asian students sitting there. And Lindsay Johnson, one of our friends who I knew was my intern, had talked to me about APALSA briefly, and I saw Marina and her 3 colleagues, and I just walked. I was like, "Excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt or to stereotype for that matter, but is this the APALSA table? Are you the board?" Because I think at that point I was already trying to get in touch with the members of APALSA. I think for an event, right? Because it was before I was a faculty member here. So that's how we met. And I will not make Marina speak, but I at least wanted to recognize Marina, who is the reason why I'm here as the APALSA advisor. And I think I just wanted to go back to Jinah said something that struck a little bit of a chord with me, and so did Allison, is that yes, we are all Asians, right? All of us on the panel and many of us, in the audience today, but it's, Asia is a continent made up of many different countries. Even each country has its own culture, and even within these countries, there are many different cultures. And then when we transport that to the United States, that creates other forms of culture. There's also gender, which, and certainly Asian men, Asian women also have different stereotypes within our cultures, and then also to the external, cultures in America. So it's, we can't, forget that it's not a monolithic group that all think the same way. It's all different groups, and even within our cultures that might be the same that we share, we're all ultimately individuals shaped by our own individual experiences. And we certainly can't forget that. We talked a lot about the past and about our own experiences in the past, and I want to talk about the future. At the rally a few weeks ago, we saw a lot of, our allies supporting us, members of the Black Lives Matters movement, and others. And I want to take a moment and perhaps ask Professor Connors is really, what do we mean by allyship, and how can we actually be better allies beyond just, going to an event or making a Facebook post, right? Those are easy things to do.
I think, getting involved in state bar groups. I think getting involved with, like APALSA and BALSA working together, because I think we're all facing similar issues and supporting each other. That's how I see an ally, just in terms of going forward. For instance, I'm working with the state bar to address racial justice issues in the juvenile justice system, the child welfare system, not just dealing with, Asian children, but children of color, Black and brown children. And I think that's how you work together. You can't, the past administration, I think, to very successfully use divisiveness as a tactic. I think the way we have to fight against that is to work together and support each other. And just, in terms of specifics, in terms of what we're doing is working with these groups in to understand if in my area of practice, right, in the child welfare, juvenile justice area, we're putting together recommendations to address racial justice issues by requesting that data be collected every time a child is being arrested, and also seeking demographic data like the age of the child, the race of the child, the gender of the child, which is not being done right now. Seeking reforms in the Department of Probation, having them including that there be programming on implicit bias. We're looking at the school to prison pipeline. Mostly it's children of color who are disproportionately suspended from school. And this leads to educational failure and truancy. So we're working with not just the, Asian lawyers, we're working with everybody. Because that's the only way we can address it. And I think as Chaula said before, the way we respond is to show that we are not divided, that we can work collectively to benefit all, and specifically to target racial injustice. And just, I have to make a plug for this, but in terms of child welfare, we're really trying to push blind removals, which is happening now in Nassau County. That's where when there are allegations of abuse or neglect, caseworkers who are going in cannot identify the zip code where the call is made. They can't identify any demographic information. All they can gather is the allegations of that alleged neglect or abuse. And then once it's determined that removal needs to be necessary, then you throw in all the demographic information again. And so, these are just examples of working together, being allies, and moving forward in a positive note.
Thank you, Professor Connors. And Brian, have you noticed any, perhaps changes in the professional affiliated groups, as a practicing attorney with, definitely with the, President Trump's statements, but how we can all be better in the professional world and perhaps a little bit divorced from, say, the educational world?
I'm sorry, what was the last part of your?
Well, I would just think, Professor Hanna spoke about what we could, what we're seeing, in the education field and the child welfare field. You work in a different practice. So have you seen any perhaps opportunities to form allies with other, attorneys from historically underrepresented groups that are really also facing struggles of their own?
Well, certainly, I think the immigration bar has maybe historically been a bit more diverse than other legal fields, and so I think there already is a sort of a built-in emphasis on or attention paid to diversity just by virtue of the clientele that we serve, and so I think those. I mean, we can certainly. There's always room for improvement. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. I think the American Immigration Lawyers Association. It's a 14,000 nationwide member bar association, and I think we have an Asian. I think there's an Asia Pacific interest group, but there is no Asian American attorney interest group within AILA, and so I think that was something interesting that I had noticed when I first joined a number of years ago. So, I think there, things are changing for sure for the better, especially, compared to when we were younger. And I think for our kids, it's going to be better for them. I'd say, the legal profession has, overall, like I said, has been historically skews very white and male. And I think, and like I said in the beginning, maybe that was unconsciously or consciously part of what drove me to want to pursue law, was to kind of fight back against that stereotype. And I think it's, if there are more Asian Americans getting into law, that's always best. And not only getting into law, but also getting into diverse practice areas. And, I wouldn't want to do it, but, hopefully there are people that do want to diversify their practices. I love doing immigration law. But I think, the bigger picture is within each community, professional communities, here we're talking about law, the more exposure that the larger community has to diverse voices, the more exposure they have, the better. And I guess a good example would be that, I'd say the average American probably in general just doesn't know that many Asian people in their day-to-day lives. And they could go, they could go years without even really talking to an Asian person, except when they're ordering Chinese food or getting their nails done, or, what they see on TV. And so that's a pretty limited, skewed view of who we are as individuals. And, you apply that same concept to particular professional fields like law, the more exposure that the larger community gets to us as individuals, I think that it can only be better for that.
And Chaula, what have you seen in perhaps your law school, even in your community, about the different affinity groups, allying with each other to combat hate?
Absolutely. I think that in terms of allyship, and we actually, Cardozo held a panel, a student-led panel with our Dean of Diversity to kind of talk about what it truly means to be an ally. So, I mean, I think the biggest thing that, was relayed was kind of just listening and listening from a place where you're not defensive, where you're not kind of centering yourself in the conversation, but really kind of trying to be there and listen to what other people's lived experiences have been. And I think what also, is really interesting that kind of has happened, I think, that I've personally seen in the South Asian community with wanting to be allies in terms of Black Lives Matter is really confronting our own community about our own attitudes. And I think that's a very uncomfortable conversation to confront anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, casteism, colorism, and all of these sort of unfortunate kind of decolonizing the way that we think about other people outside of our community. But I think that those are very important conversations to have with our older family members, with the next generation, and just kind of really be able to confront our own internal biases too, because I think that there's this, yes, as you were saying, within, being Indian or being South Asian can mean a lot of different things. And from region to region and city to city, there's so much difference, whether it's, what you could go somewhere different and there different food you're eating, different, ways to worship, different ways you wear clothing. And I think we have a lot of work to do, I think, within our own communities, in terms of becoming allies. But I think that's disrupting, the way that we think and kind of confronting our own internal biases is extremely important. Those are very uncomfortable conversations to have, but I think they're important conversations too.
And I just want to say too, when we talk about allies, we're seeing them right now. I'm seeing Dean Willett. I'm seeing Dean Queenan. I'm seeing David Kraft. I'm seeing Professor Lynch. I'm seeing Professor Connors. So, our colleagues and the deans are showing that there are allies. And I think also when you think about being an ally, as law students and as lawyers, you have privilege. And I think you can be an ally to those that are underrepresented, to support them. And I think we see that in the clinical education that we do. And we see that for the pro bono work that all of you do. And that is also being an ally.
And thank you, Professor Connors. And we didn't plan this, but that serves as a very good segue, because you've heard a lot from our panelists, and I want to thank all of the panelists for sharing very personal stories. But would any of our allies like to either ask questions or say anything personal they want to contribute to this conversation? We certainly enjoy hearing from them. Just, I guess, if you can use the raise your hand feature, that makes it easier. But if anybody would like to share, I see Dean Willett here. I don't want to put the Dean on the spot, but if the Dean would like to share anything.
I'll just share that, this is, I think that this gathering tonight is really meaningful. It means a lot to me to be included and to learn and to listen and to see some friends from outside the law school and inside the law school, and students and faculty who are all willing to speak up on these issues that are so personal. And so thank you to everyone who's involved in putting it together and bringing the community together. And this is a time when, as a community, we have to figure out how to be allies to one another. We have to stand up for one another, and it's sometimes hard. Sometimes I have no idea what to say, what's the right thing, what's the right moment. And I try to listen and learn, and I think we all are learning from one another as we grow. But that's what makes it a really good community. And if we can give each other that space, we can be better. It's been a hard time. So, but thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this.
Well, thank you for attending. I know how busy you are, and I imagine this must be your 13th, 14th, or even 15th hour on Zoom just today, right? I'm not even counting any other day, but just today. So thank you for attending. Professor Lynch.
What she said, and I have learned for so many of the panelists and from my students, from Ashley Hahn, who was in my DV seminar last semester, from Chaula when she was a student in my domestic violence seminar and took me after class and suggested that I present something a little differently. And I have ever since then. And it was actually on a different issue of race and how to talk about a particular case that Jaya and I worked on together years ago. And so I thank you for making yourself vulnerable today by being on the panel and by attending, because I think our vulnerabilities are our strengths. And that's not saying that we shouldn't have boundaries and we shouldn't protect, but they say it's in our brokenness that we forge the strongest chains and links. And so I want to thank you for sharing with me your strengths and your vulnerabilities.
Thank you. Rushi?
Hi guys. So I don't know if I count as an ally. I just thank you all for coming. I wanted to just say thank you to the e-board and Professor Jim, as well as some other help that we had with the questions. Michelle and Alex Marie, who helped me take a look at them and refine and reform them to get some great messages out from our excellent panelists. I guess I wanted to share how interesting playing this event has been in terms of confronting my own identity. A lot of the panelists shared things that I really resonated with, which were like not wanting to be the Asian person in the room. And sometimes working on these events and doing these, having these discussions is hard for me because we're sitting around talking about how Asian we are to some degree. And that's so difficult. So I really appreciate getting to work on this and getting to hear all of you guys speak, because it was very cathartic, because you do have to do it, right? You do have to, as Jinah said, you do have to like be Asian and be a student and do both at the same time and not sort of run away from it. So I guess I was wondering to some of the panelists, especially to some of them who are older, because I can't imagine having to do this work continuously all the time, how you sort of continue being inspired and continue to inspire us, which you all do. And keep it up when it gets tiring, cathartic, and oh man, I have to confront being Asian and racism again today. And how do you do that?
Well, Louis, if you don't mind, since I'm the oldest on this panel, I'll start. I'm tired,
I'm gonna comment on that.
Tired. Rushi worked on helped me with, I'm on the police reform board, so she was so helpful with that. Talk about allies. You are an ally, Rushi. I'm tired. I get up in the morning and I walk my dogs, and my neighbor across the street is still waving his big Trump flag. It's still there. I walked my dogs on my road, and I think 1.5 years to 2 years ago, someone hurled a hate slur at me, right? Racist slur at me. My mother will not walk outside the house anymore. So when she's 85 years old, so when she goes for walks, she's in Texas. I have to add that caveat. She is in Texas. But you know, she doesn't go outside. She's an avid walker. She walks inside the house and then she goes in the backyard. I have great sadness that my dad passed away in 2018, and he passed away during the reign of President Trump. You know, he was hoping for Hillary. He really wanted Hillary. So I find that to be really heartbreaking when I think about that. I'm tired, but then I think, you know, my grandfather took that exam like 7 times. He didn't stop, right? And I have that strength in me, and I see all of you, and I see that same strength going through all of you. You know, I see it in you. I see it in some of the other students. I see it here now. I see it in Jessica Haller. I saw it in Gianni. I see it in Chaula, who I worked with at the clinic. I mean, I see it in all of you. And we have to just persevere, because what choice do we have, right? What choice do we have? Do we just give up and say, oh, that's it, I'm not going to do this anymore? You can't, right? That's not an option. And you all as law students, you have privilege. You can make a difference in the world. You can do it. I feel like I'm in one of those like Star Wars movies, like, you know, like giving over and saying you have powers, but you really do. I mean, the gift of, you know, being an attorney and just your ability to affect change is enormous. So use this time, you know, and as I think Professor Lynch was saying, this discussion helps us not to be so reactive. It helps us to think and plan proactively, you know, and that's huge.
I want to jump in. I'm older than I think a lot of the students. I hope, Ruchi, that's okay. But I also just want to say that I think when you're doing any kind of legal work, whether it's like public interest or private sector, you're not always going to get appreciation. You're not always going to get a thank you. You're not always going to get recognition or affirmation that what you're doing is, you know, helpful or has made a difference. But I do think along the way, there's going to be a lot of really great, like sort of small, like moments. And I think just those moments, I think, keep you going no matter how long you've been doing this for. And I think it's interesting because talking about identity and like, I think as a South Asian woman, like there's so much competition, like you're always like, you know, feeling like you're kind of being pitted against like your cousin or this person or that person, and who got this SAT score and who did, you know, it's like this thing. And I think that almost makes us anxious to really like get close with people from our own community because we feel this like inherent competition. But I think just getting older and like forming friendships or relationships with people like, you know, from different communities and kind of seeing that that's a common theme. And I have this really nice moment with a student where we had a meeting, you know, on Zoom, and we talked about kind of career counseling stuff. And then after the Zoom, I got an email from her inviting me to Diwali celebration that was happening like virtually. And I don't know, I thought that was just really nice. It really kind of made my day, and it made me think, wow, if a student can kind of see, you know, so often not seeing people reflected, like the representation, or, you know, you feel like your professors and everybody, you know, you might not be able to identify with, but I don't know, it just really meant something to me. She probably didn't even think she was gonna like make me so excited or happy, but just her saying, hey, we're doing this, like you should come and join us. I don't know, to me that was like a really like nice moment. And I think those types of moments are what kind of like, no matter what work you're doing, like, I don't know, you have to have a little bit of optimism, a little bit of joy too. So I think like those small moments can kind of make a difference.
Thank you. And I received a private question, so I want to pose it to the panel and to try to phrase it correctly. But, you know, at a few times we've all talked about, you know, the trauma we faced with President Trump, with the shootings in Georgia, or even the, you know, just practicing and living in America with whether it's, you know, even microaggressions add up. So how do we, and first, how do we deal with it, but also how can we help our, you know, law students on this call who are really, you know, forming their identities now, handle this really I think the trauma of, say, identity. We were pulled into different identities. We often feel like we're not just in two worlds, but many worlds. So if anybody wants to speak to that question. I know it's a tough question, but I don't know that I know the answer myself, but if anybody does. Professor Lynch, I see your hand raised. I don't know if that's an old hand or a new hand. Okay.
No, that is because it's 7:30 in the evening and I forget to put my hand out. I apologize.
I guess, Louis, I could address that. I don't know if this directly answers your question, but I did something recently that is, maybe it's kind of weird, but I decided, with all the anti-Asian violence going on over the past year, and again, I'll say that this, it has been going on for the entire year, and it hasn't really got into the public consciousness in a major way until, I don't know, just like a few months ago. But really, Asian Americans have been seeing this go on for the entire past year since the pandemic started. But what I did was I started making a list of every single racist incident I could think of, that I had experienced since childhood. And it was ridiculous. I was like, OMG, this is ridiculous. I think I ended up with like at least 30 and those are the ones that I could remember or knew about. And who knows what, had happened without my knowledge. But there was something cathartic about just seeing it all on paper. And, I guess I just kind of laughed at it when I finally saw it on paper, because some of these memories, if I think about it, I'm still that little kid with some of these incidents when I think about it. But then seeing it all written out, I just thought, wow, this is crazy that, I've had this all stored up in my head for years. And we had talked about earlier that this is something, we, as a community, we had never really, it wasn't part of our culture to talk about it. And we're always told, just keep your head down, ignore it and just move on. And, we've internalized all of this. But now with this kind of release, and, it was a relief, I think, to kind of get it all out there and just look at it and see it for what it was. I don't know, it helped me. I don't know what my point is really, but I found it really helpful to do this and realize that, it's nothing to be ashamed of. I guess maybe for years, I always, it was kind of like, I think as a kid, or not even as a kid, when I was, teenager or in my 20s, when someone would yell, shut up Chinese or something like that, I think my gut reaction was always, well, it's factually true. And so, there's nothing to be, I shouldn't be offended by it. But now I think the correct reaction, and hopefully what we can pass on to our kids, is that, you don't accept things like that. And, you're going to have to speak up when faced with things like that.
Thank you. Jinah?
Oh, yes, I totally agree with everything that Brian's saying. And I think about even the way in which I had come to first accept my identity as a Korean American. And a lot of times it happened in community with other Asian or Korean Americans at that time when I was in high school, to be able to understand that I'm not the only one going through this. And there's other people who look like me who have this like cross-cultural identity crisis. So I think creating the space in our law school to continue having these conversations, but to really connect and form a community, and being able to see individuals in leadership positions who look like us. So whether it's on boards or as professors, and being able to have mentors who have gone through it, because a lot of the other panelists today, like, you've gone through it and you've paved the way for us, and we live in a very different world because of you. But at the same time, like, there are still shared experiences and so much that we can learn from. And something that a friend said to me recently was how, like, within community, a lot of times we talk about like self-care, like, you know, if you're organizing a rally or doing all this stuff and a lot of emotional trauma and stress, like you have to have self-care. But where does that self-care come from if you don't have a community to allow you to actually take that space and time and work, you know, to focus on yourself? You need a community around you to be willing to carry the weight while you know, rest or whatever it is that you to take care of your kids, or you know, just to give you some examples. So I think having that community of you know, people and understanding what that care would look like between us is very important.
Thank you. And that's I'd like to, at this point, I do have one more question for the panelists, but before I put, there was a question from the audience, the question that I want to ask all the panelists. I want to ask them before I do that, but I want to speak with this wellness point, and I'd like to ask Alex Marie Baez, the law school's new diversity, equity, inclusion postgraduate fellow, who also my TA for 2 years in lawyering. So thank you, Alex Marie, did a wonderful job, to speak about wellness, especially, you know, for members of the law school community.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for having me. I've actually learned a lot at this panel. It's been very interesting for me. And I'm not Asian American, but I am Hispanic American, and I have really resonated with a lot of what was said here. And I think what we kind of learned is that, you know, there is a shared experience in that way of just not being white, I suppose, in America. But in terms of wellness, you know, Jinah was just talking about self-care, and like you have to have a community to have that self-care. And part of your self-care can be, you know, talking with someone who's willing to listen. And, you know, for the students, like I'm that person for you guys right now, you know, especially when it comes to these issues of race and culture, and like maybe not even issues, maybe you just have no one else to say something to and you just want to say it, you know, you just want someone to just hear your words. Like when she mentioned community, I was thinking about that, you know, I was thinking about having, you know, just friends and people and just a person that's like there to hear you sometimes is all you really need. But also being okay with taking that time to step back and reflect on all you have done and what else is coming up is also a part of that. And when I was a lawyer in TA, I used to tell my students all the time, like, I'm sorry to tell you, Professor Jim, but like, you know, if they were really stressed and their appellate brief was due, I was like, it's fine, just take time off. Like that's always more important. And, you know, especially in these times, it's really, really important to make sure you're taking toll of what's going on, you know, mentally for yourself. You know, you don't always have to be on. You don't always have to be the one moving things forward. It's okay to take yourselves out of those roles sometimes and, you know, pass the reins along to somebody else, or just take that breather. I'm a really big believer in it, and I know it doesn't always feel possible either, but you can't get much done if you're overworked and exhausted, you know, so definitely, you know, consider where your community's at and who's a part of that community. I'm a part of your little community now, and I'm happy to be here. And we have so many people at the Albany Law School campus who are a part of this allyship, other than, you know, we have Professor Jim and everyone who's here today, but you all know that there's support out there. And I'm really thankful for this event because it's been, I feel like this has been a whole little community building event in and of itself. So thank you for organizing this. Would love to see more of these. And thank you for letting me speak on wellness. I'm a big supporter of mental health. I meditate and teach yoga myself. So definitely don't forget to think about yourselves when you're also thinking about the larger collective.
Thank you, Alex Marie. Now, taking time for yourself, this actually leads into the question that I was asked to ask of the panelists, you know, taking time for fun. And so to each of our panelists, what do you like to do for fun? Can you start with Allison?
Well, I am a big fan of Sunhee's in Troy. So I do recommend that. The food is excellent there. I am very, you know, I like to be outdoors. I live up in Saratoga. That is something that definitely helps me with stress. And, you know, it gives me, you know, I hike a lot of the 46 peaks. It's the biggest park in the United States, which a lot of people don't know. And there's so many different parts, towns. It's, you know, the Adirondacks has really become a big part of my life up here. And it's something that is very fun to me. And I highly recommend it to anybody else.
Professor Connors?
I feel like Allison took all my answers from me. I was going to say food, and I was going to talk about.
I think we might have froze up. Professor Connors might have froze up on us a little bit. Okay, we'll see if she comes back. But Brian?
I do the New York Times crossword puzzle every day. I enjoy cooking. And then, let's see, in the summertime, I play tennis. In the wintertime, I curl at the Schenectady Curling Club. And we're always looking for new members.
Thank you. Professor Connors, we lost you for a little bit. So I wanted to make sure you had a chance to speak.
I was going to say food and hiking, but I'm also, I have to say at this point in time, and I'm a big sci-fi fan. So I also have gotten into Star Trek Discovery, which is a great show. It's mindless. It's fun. I'm not reading cases. I'm not looking at statutes. I'm getting away from everything. So I also like yoga.
Thank you. Chaula?
Well, I have a little 2.5-year-old daughter who keeps me very busy. So I think the most fun is definitely hanging out with her. And sometimes she'll pop into my Zoom calls and she's got a ton of energy. But I do like to watch Bravo, and I'm not afraid to put that out there. Yeah, just, you know, some reality kind of escapism. And definitely going to restaurants is also something I really enjoy, and, you know, haven't had much of, but I'm happy to be able to get back to supporting local restaurants.
Thank you. Jinah?
So it's funny, when I need a break from law school, I work at the restaurant. And when I need a break from working at the restaurant, I read I read assignments and stuff. So it kind of like works hand in hand. But I think ultimately, I really did just like enjoy like hosting people, drinking and eating and socializing to the best of my ability, but just discovering new spaces and being able to be inspired from new foods and adventures.
Thank you. And before we conclude, I do want to recognize someone in the audience today who I know has been a mentor to many people on the panel, been a mentor to many people who are not on the panel, to many of our guests. So, and that's Lillian Moy, who I had the honor of meeting 2 years ago. You know, Lillian, I don't know if you want to tell us what you like to do for fun, or if you have any other thoughts to share. I know many of us would welcome it.
Well, I want to thank you all because I thought this was great and a real moment that we all need to be together. So thank you. And I love to practice yoga, and I love to eat good food as at Jinah's place, and to be with you has been really a joy. So thank you.
Thank you, Lillian. And hopefully we can all soon do this, perhaps at Sunhee's, when we can be in person and celebrate as a community. You know, obviously we all know how hard it is forming community on Zoom. We have been able to do it. Hopefully we can all do it, be together in a few short months in a much closer community. I want to thank all of our panelists. I especially want to thank Jinah, because Jinah is the only one who has an appellate brief due either next week or in 2 weeks, I suppose, right? So we all remember what that's like. Even those who are on the panel, we might not want to remember what that's like, but we do remember what's that like. So thank you. And other 1Ls who took the time to come. I also know how much you have to do this week and next week. So thank you for taking the time. All of our guests, whether you are a member of the law school community or not, I think tonight you at least showed that we are all at least one community. So thank you to all our panelists. Thank you, Chaula. One of the nice things about the Zoom world is that we can have guests from, far, and it's not easy coming up here from New York City, even in the best of times. So thank you for coming with us, spending time with us. Brian, the billable hours, I remember what that was like from my time at Bond, and our friend Cliff, who I understand is no longer practicing law. He found another path. Allison, Professor Connors, thank you for all of us. The dean, again, thank you for showing up. I was asked to announce that our event is concluding, or this is the conclusion, but if anybody wants to stay on and talk, there are some, that's certainly possible. So thank you, everyone.
I'd just like to thank
Thank
all
you,
of our
Louis.
panelists and everybody else who attended this event again. It couldn't have been made possible without you and on such short notice. And I will be putting the hosting to Ruchi now, who will make some breakout rooms for anybody who would like to speak individually, I guess, or just hang out, I guess, with either some of our panelists or I don't know, Ruchi, you take over. And thank you again all for attending. This was very illuminating, and it was really great to hear everybody's perspective on different issues.
Yeah, if anybody wants to stay and debrief, I'm going to stick around. We can tell jokes or whatever, but I know it's late, so feel free to do whatever you want to do. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. I can't say, I have an 8 a.m. My appellate briefs are due next week, so I have an 8 a.m. tomorrow with a student.
I'll send you my best jokes later,
Yeah,
Professor Jim.
okay, and
Thank you so
you
much.
also don't want to hear me sing, so I don't know that the breakout rooms will help you. But thank you again to all of our panelists for taking the time. I know how busy it is from not just your professional lives, but family lives as well. All of our guests, and I hope thank you. We really enjoyed hearing from all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all
Thank
again.
you.
Thank you. It was nice to meet you all, those of you that I haven't met.
Thanks.
Louis, this was great. Thank you too for all the work that you did
Oh,
on this.
no,
So really
thanks.
appreciate
I
your
really do
moderation.
mean it when I say the credit goes to the e-board. I feel like I was, the passenger in the back seat of the station wagon and not the driver. It was, Eileen, really, we started talking, I think, shortly after the situation. So, thank you to the executive board.
I'll plug Professor Jim. Professor Jim was incredible in helping us hone in on our questions and also like doing an incredible job transitioning during the panel. I was quite floored. My favorite was the let's talk about the future now that we finished talking about the past transition. Really exemplary moderation work.
It's always important to talk about the future, right? I always feel like, look, we learn from the past, right? I'm a big fan of history, and I think we sometimes forget about the past, and that's been a lot of problems for us. We learn from the past, but don't get stuck in the past, right? We need to move forward, and it's the Martin Luther King is I'm going to get this quote wrong, but it's the arc of justice bends, or civilization bends to the arc of justice, but it's slow. I'm sorry I messed it up. Someone can look it up and get it.
The arc of justice is long, but it always no, I got it wrong too.
Ends in the direct.
Right. Bends towards justice, but we know
yes,
that. Right?
There's an arc of morality and justice and some bending, which is very yoga. But
thank you, and thank you everyone. And I apologize, I cannot stay because I need to get some sleep to prepare for my meeting tomorrow. I have I'm in meetings from 8 to 4, and then I have another panel. But thank you everyone, and thank you to the
Thank you, Professor Jim, for moderating. You did a great job. Thank you to all the panelists, and I'm gonna stop the recording now.